Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We have a great session lined up for you today. Before we get started, there are just a few general housekeeping points to cover. First and foremost, please use the online question tool to post any questions that you have, and we will share them with our speakers. Second, if you experience any technical difficulties today, please use the same question tool, and a member of our admin team will be on hand to support you. And finally, just to note, this session is being recorded, and we'll be sharing a copy of the recording with you via email in the coming days. So, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our speakers to get us started. Over to you, Samir.
Thank you, Kalichi. Welcome everyone to our webinar today about IAM and Luxology. The title of our webinar is Enablement in a Post-Amgen World From Antibodies to Artificial Intelligence. I'll be joined today by my partner at the Oblon firm, Richard Kelly. He's a co-chair in our life sciences group and a member of our chemical litigation and ITC litigation practices. He has a world of experience in many matters with litigation, chemical patents, life sciences patents, and he's well read on the issues we're talking about today. Just a quick note about our firm. We have a full service IP firm. We do all kinds of technology. We do patent drafting, prosecution, all forms of IP litigation. And we work with a lot of law firms all over the world. So many of our friends and colleagues over the world are probably going to watch this as well. If you ever buy the USPTO, sorry, next slide. If you're ever visiting the US Patent and Trademark Office, we're located right next door. So definitely if you're in the area, please send us an email. We'd be glad to team up with you if you're in the area. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Richard. He'll give us a little bit of the history of enablement and kind of give some of the details of the Amgen case as we start our discussion.
Hey, thank you, Samir. If you could go to the next slide. The key point, which a lot of people forget, I think many Americans forget, is that our patent law is rooted in common law. And it begins with the United Kingdom statute of monopolies, although it was only England at the time, as interpreted by the UK courts up to about 1790, although the American courts have looked to the interpretation of it post that, and certainly as recently as Arthrex in deciding whether or not IPRs were constitutionally approved or not. So if you don't understand common law, you're probably not going to get what's going on with enablement. Next slide. Next slide. Now the key here is that what you're looking at, and you have to start with, the very first patent law that the United States had an enablement requirement, as you can see here. And if you read the statute, there's two things. The patentee gets a patent, but there's consideration for that patent, and the consideration is enablement, which means that the public, when the patent expires, can practice the patent, generally speaking, without any experimentation, although you may need to use some ordinary skill. Next slide. Next slide. And we began seeing the enablement requirement being interpreted by the courts shortly after litigation and patents began. And here it is, expressing the concept that consideration is what the public gets in return for the grant of the monopoly. If you've done any contract work, you'll understand that this is basically the quid pro quo for what's going on. Next slide. Next slide. And what we have is another case a few years later by the same judge. I should stop here and say one thing. In Amgen, there's a lot of citations to Justice Story and federal cases. The American legal system, the court system, changed dramatically in the late 19th century. It went from a system where you had the Supreme Court and you had district courts, but the district courts were not like they are today. They were not general jurisdiction, they were restricted jurisdiction. And then you had what they called a circuit court. Now, the circuit court is important because the only judges in the circuit court until towards the end of the 19th century were Supreme Court justices. And Justice Story, who did the Cutter case and is now in the Wyeth case, was a justice on the Supreme Court for about 40 years and was recognized as one of the leading lights in patent law in the United States in the early days. And in the Wyeth case, you had, again, both these cases we're talking about were mechanical cases, and the specification described a method of cutting ice without human power. Now, that was one of two embodiments that the patent described. But what the court did is they followed the law at the time was that if any embodiment in the patent was unpatentable, the whole patent fell. And so what they look at here is they talk about the claims unmaintainable as a point of law, because there was no means for performing the task at hand, the function. Next slide. Next slide. Now what we have is it's what the court called an abstract idea, and said that what the claim was doing was basically preempting all possible means of cutting ice to the same size. Now this sounds an awful lot like an abstract idea, which it probably is, but abstract ideas and enablement are really the same thing, with the difference being on their effect in litigation. In litigation, if it's an enablement question, that's a question of fact and law, which requires at least going through to summary judgment decisions, but most often to trial, as happened in Amgen. If it's an abstract idea, there's a complete failure, a legal failure. You don't have a legal cause of action, so no trial is necessary. But in both cases, you're looking at a lack of enablement. And one, it's complete, and enablement is partial. Next slide, please. Now here it describes what the second embodiment was. This means that in today's terminology, Wyeth would have been an enablement case because it did enable an embodiment, just not the full scope of what the applicant was after. And you'll see that when if you ever look at the Morse case, there's a big discussion of, is it an abstract idea, is it a law of nature, or is it an enablement question? And in Morse, the Supreme Court ultimately came down on enablement for Claim 8, which was using electromagnetism to send messages. Next slide, please. Next slide. Can we get to the next? There we go. Now, by 1853, we begin to see the Supreme Court weighing in by pointing out that you cannot have a patent for a function only, or an abstract effect, but only for the machine which produces it. Now, this doesn't mean you can't have functional limitations in a claim, but the claim has to have sufficient structure so that you're defining how you're achieving it. Now, the other thing is at this time, there was no such things as means plus function claims. So that's a later development, but the fact is, function-only claims are inherently suspect. Next slide, please. And what you're looking at, as you can see from these three cases is there's a quid pro quo that runs through the court enablement decisions. This is the consideration for the grant of the monopoly. By the mid to late 19th century, the commentators, Clifford and Robinson, were referring to this as the contract theory of patents. In other words, the patent had to enable the practice of the invention by one of ordinary skill in the art, as we'd say it today, as a consideration for the grant of the patent. And if it failed to do that, you had a failure of consideration under contract law, the contract was void. So when you're talking about looking at enablement, that's the whole underpinning policy behind it. And in common law, what the purpose of the common law is, the decisions of the court should be furthering the public policy. Next slide, please. And this is Robinson on patent in 1890 laid out exactly what was going on, citing back to a decision in 1831. And again, he talks about it creating a contract. The patent is not granted to the inventor as a favor, but in return for his compliance with the enablement requirement. And this is the whole foundation. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things that struck me when I read the Amgen case was not the result, I expected it, but the comments I read from some of the commentators who thought the sky was falling and that antibody development was going to be frustrated. What those authors did not consider was that if there's a lack of enablement, you're also frustrating the public policy by basically getting a monopoly on something you didn't enable, which is going to frustrate others from trying to develop competing technology. If you look at the antibody area, generally, the accused infringer has taken at least as long and done at least as many experiments as the patentee did. Basically, the only thing that the antibody case often is actually teaching people is the natural law that's being taken advantage of. Of course, natural laws can't be patented. So what you want to remember is enablement is required so that you don't have a patent which frustrates the purpose of the patent law. Next slide, please. And one of the things that's important is the standard for enablement does not change either over time or from technology to technology. In other words, the standard today is the same as it was back in 1813. But technology changes. And what may have been a very unpredictable art has become predictable. So now let's go to the next slide, please. When I joined the patent office in 1970, cancer was considered an curing or treating cancer was considered an incredible utility and required proof of actually doing it in a human. And it was on a par with perpetual motion machines. Incredible utility. Within a decade, cancer went from being an incredible utility to something that was reasonably predictable based on animal testing. So the advancement of technology may change the quantum of proof and turn things which would not have been earlier enabled into things that are enabled. So you have to be careful when you look at old cases that you're not talking about the technology changing such that predictability changes. Next slide, please. Now, Justice Gorsuch in the Amgen decision noted that some experimentation was acceptable. Now, in the wood case, this was a process for making bricks by mixing coal dust and the clay. And what the case talked about was the general rule of this whole thing was that the proportion of dust and clay was what was set forth in the patent. But each clay is a little different. Coal dust can be a little different. As the court upheld the claim, but recognizing that small differences may be required given the varieties of clay. In other words, but they looked at it as being somebody skilled in the art would know that the clay properties varied and they'd have to tweak one way or the other the ratio. Mineral separation is the same thing. Here, the record was clear that you needed some what they call preliminary tests to adapt the process to any particular ore. Now, it was not practical for the patentee to test every single ore, but what he did do was provide a reasonable way of doing it and guidance as to how to go there. And again, certainty in the laws, according to the court, was not greater than is reasonable. And they talked about the impossibility. Now, if we're talking about today, what am I doing when I'm before the patent office or an expert or in litigation? Basically, you're going to use expert testimony to justify whether or not this is simply tweaking or routine experimentation or involves undue experimentation. Now, in the patent office, it's a 132 declaration. In district court, you're going to have the battle of the experts. And one of the advantages they will have that you don't run into in the patent office is how long it took everybody to develop their work. If the infringer was very quick, much shorter than the patentee, then you probably have an enabled disclosure. Next slide. This is the various cases on enablement out of the Supreme Court covered a multitude of technologies, from generally electrical in the first grouping of cases, Morse being telegraph, electromagnetism, electric light bulbs, to electric condensers, to glue in the Holland furniture case, chemistry, and Wyeth v. Stone was mechanical. Policy consideration, each of those decisions stayed the same. Next slide, please. Again, it's important to note, to remember, the court did not prohibit all experimentation, but in Amgen, Judge Gorsuch considered the disclosure to be basically an assignment to do research. And then, if we can go next slide. And what the concept was of enablement was to prevent the expenditure of time and money in trying experiments where the deficiencies made it impractical for such a man to construct it. In other words, if it was something where the ordinary skill of the mechanic could follow the patent, make the necessary changes, and get the result, it was going to be enabled. But if he couldn't, without a lot of experiments beyond what was normal, it was not enabled. In Amgen, you had a very small percentage of the antibodies which were going to work. Next slide. Next slide. Now, in antibody work, you had two things going on. You needed to have the amino acid sequence, which was fairly easy to foresee, but also the folding of the protein. And Amgen's expert, and this is critical, right out of the bat, testified that that if somebody had a method of predicting how the protein would fold, that would be worthy of a Nobel Prize. And the case was probably over at that point. The fact is that both the ability of the antibody to bind and its ability to achieve the therapeutic result depended on folding. And while some folding might get binding, that same folding might not get the therapeutic result. Again, this is something that in the Amgen case was brought in by the battle of the experts. In patent office practice, it's going to be by declarations. If you're challenging filing dates in an IPR, it's going to be by expert testimony. Next slide, please. And one of the things people have suggested is means plus function claims. Well, means plus function claims are really a shorthand way of putting into a claim the means and functions that are described in the specification. So what you have to do is they're limited to the means identified in the specification and their equivalents, but they got to be recognized at the time of filing. Now, the problem with antibodies is you don't know what the equivalent is because you can't predict how it's going to fold. So for people who are interested, how do I get claims on antibodies? You got to do a lot more work and try to identify as many factors as you can that might allow you to give people guidance as to how to go about it. But in Amgen, if you look at those claims, they were function-only claims. There was no corresponding structure and no attempt to incorporate the means that were in the specification, some 20 specific antibodies. Next slide, please. Now, recently, on remand from the CFC, the American Axle, the district court was instructed they had to look at claim 1 to see if that, in fact, was enabled or was an abstract idea. And what the court did, and what the patentee did, was they looked heavily at the specification and relied upon it. And they used the specification to interpret claim 1. This is the same approach that was taken in the Morse case. In the Morse case, the specification saved 7 out of the 8 claims. The 8th claim to using electromagnetism failed. In American Axle, the same thing happened. The specification saved it. Now, if you're an ex-party prosecution, remember, the examiners often ignore the specification. So you've got to bring them back to that in your arguments, and you may have to provide an expert declaration. Now, again, in litigation, you're going to have the advantage of discovery, and you're going to be able to compare the relative times and efforts that it took the accused infringer to develop his infringing technique as compared to the patentee. And if they're about the same, you probably have an enablement problem. And again, you're going to use expert testimony to support that. And the last slide. Last slide, please. Next slide, rather. Basically, Amgen sought to monopolize the entire class by their function. That's going to get you in trouble. The other concept that comes out of Amgen, broad claims are nice, but just remember your enablement has to be broad as well. In some arts, that's very, very possible because you can have predictions, but in others, it's not so predictable. And so you need to look very carefully at that. Turn it over, since I don't see any questions, I'll turn it over to Samir.
All right, Kalichi, yeah, definitely please stay on this slide. Yeah, Richard, sorry, go back to the previous slide, thank you. Yeah, Richard gave a great history of enablement, definitely the aspect that there's a trade-off in what the patentee is giving, what the public is getting, and to not give them too much to the patentee. Last time Supreme Court gave a major decision on a major patent statute was Alice versus CLS Bank. And even though that particular set of facts was confined to financial instruments, financial software tools, the ramifications were pretty big across the board. I mean, they basically took 35 U.S.C. 101, they reinterpreted or they emphasized interpretation of it, and it affected everything. I mean, I work a lot in software patents, a lot of communications patents, a lot of patents that really aren't structural by nature, and all of those got heavily impacted by 35 UFC 101. We saw abstract idea projections across the board, and we're still trying to figure out the best way to strategize to deal with a 101 issue. So in this case was coming up, it's paying close attention to what they're talking about, because how would it affect patents across the board? And this quote from Amgen kind of solidifies what we were thinking. Amgen is trying to monopolize an entire class of things divided by their function. And then they use, like Richard had mentioned, they use cases in all kinds of arts, the incandescent lamp case, the Morse case. They didn't just focus on antibody cases to make their decision. They're looking at every art possible. And then they had this key quote in the decision that, the broader the monopoly the patentee is demanding, the more it must enable. This holds true whether the case involves telegraphs, glues, or antibody treatments. So they're kind of signaling what they're talking about in this case is going to affect everyone. Next slide, please. So when they talk about functional claims, we're not just talking about antibodies. There are certain situations where the patentee, is literally trying to get what we consider to be a functional claim. This is a situation in which really the structure doesn't change, but what you do with the structure does. And we see it very heavily in computer technology, especially the computer technology and software technology that's existent today. One of the best examples is the smartphone. The smartphone is a device that is, has some standard features across the board. You got your camera, your display screen, your touch screen, GPS functionality, all kinds of nice gadgets in this one device. What really enhances the device is what the app developers do with it. How they take those different structural features of the device and apply it for their own purpose. And that's the situation where the structure really isn't changing from phone to phone. It's what the software does with it that can make the actual functionality come alive. We see it with television technology, with cloud computing technology, and cell phone technology as well. It's a lot of the programming that's making the novel features and nothing really structural. Doesn't mean there aren't structural changes happening in these industries, but from a software development point of view and an app development point of view, it's really that function that defines what their commercial value is. Next slide, please. So years ago, I made up an example to kind of show why you want a broad sort of structural claim to go with your function. And this is an old app, the Shazam app, where you can hold up your phone, to someone playing music, and then it can recognize, what song it is and tell you what song you're hearing. Sometimes you might just want to know what song is playing, and it's a very useful tool for doing that. But you can see that the way they patented that claim is they call it, a system for recognizing a media entity. And you're doing landmarking and fingerprinting of an object. You have an analysis object. These are all software constructs in the claim. Next slide, please. But what you're really doing at that point is you're doing sort of a concept claim if you're a patent practitioner. You want to, if you're the company with this patent, you want to cover the concept of identifying songs based on a captured audio sample. You don't want to limit it to whatever computer platform you're on. So kind of your worst case scenario is that you have kind of the legacy way of drafting patents is you need to describe all your functionality in the patent application. Then at the end, you kind of have a boilerplate description of your computer, the CPU that has RAM, that's memory, and you've covered your base for having computer structure in your patent application. But the problem with that, though, is that if you're maybe, the Shazam company or like a company with a functional kind of patent, you don't want your actual patent to be limited to covering a personal desktop computer, in terms of claim interpretation. You want to cover everything. You want to cover smartphones, you want to cover the cloud computing environment. You don't know what your competitors are going to actually do to implement this technology. You also don't know how that technology is going to change. If you started making your patent in the early 2000s, maybe, the laptop computer or the desktop computer was your target structure. You may not see coming this whole cloud computing model where literally your phone is just a portal and all the processing is done externally to your phone because of our high-speed internet now. So in the software arts, you are essentially trying to claim a function or even an inventive concept independent of the structure. So when the Supreme Court starts talking about functional claims and how they should be interpreted, the big red flag has to go up if you're in software. And that's why this particular case is important to pay attention to, especially if you're in the software arts or, anything where it's heavily reliant upon functional advances in technology. Next slide, please. So even the USPTO has sort of pointed to this distinction. This is sort of a couple of slices of guidance from the NPEP that they give to examiners in the US system. They say, hey, for a mechanical invention, they call it a fairly predictable field. And so there's a lower level of detail required to satisfy the written description requirement. And so in that case of Atheon versus Ashley Furniture, the USPTO is pointing to this case saying, hey, if you're in the mechanical arts, you don't need as many detail to satisfy the written description requirement. But in the same section of the NPEP, they point to a distinction of software inventions. You need to provide a description of how certain features work. There's less predictability in software arts, and therefore there can be a higher scrutiny as to what you have to put into your description. This comes from the TransPerfect Global versus Mattel case. So we're seeing there is a distinction between mechanical arts and software arts in terms of what the patentee needs to provide in their own description to make sure they're satisfying these requirements over what the claim scope is going to entail. And this is explicit in the NPEP, it's explicit in our case law. And in some of the examples I'm about to show, we have to be really careful with some of the new advances in technology and software. Next slide, please. So this brings us to artificial intelligence. One of the reasons why we wanted to do this presentation is that, the case Amgen deals with life sciences, pharmaceutical patents, but there's a whole spectrum of cases that have this idea of broad functional claiming. And AI jumps out to me as a particular type of technology that might be vulnerable to this kind of scrutiny. In artificial intelligence, sometimes you have what's considered a black box. You train it to do some kind of task. Maybe it's recognition, image recognition, or speech recognition. You don't necessarily know what you're making at the time. You just know you're going to train it with data, and it's going to get smart, and it's going to be able to perform different tasks based on how well you train it. And we came up with an example about self-driving cars, right? So self-driving cars perform a lot of object recognition. They're going to look for different objects on the roadway. They're going to look for different objects in the environment, and the car itself is going to have to make decisions on what to do in response to that recognition. So it's a very valuable commercial technology, especially with a lot of the new cars on the market today. So in this hypothetical example, suppose you have a claim that says send a signal to a car to take action X in response to detecting a non-vehicle moving object within Y feet of the car. It's probably a broad claim that a patentee would love to have because they're trying to broadly claim taking an action in response to detecting anything non-vehicle in the roadway. Now, maybe the specification in this example takes into account certain non-vehicle objects that could be recognized in video images, maybe pedestrians on bicycles, and other types of objects. And maybe it describes how maybe the neural network or the object recognition model is actually trained to recognize those objects. But we look at the Amgen case again, after someone gets that claim. The full scope of the claim in this case covers detection of any non-vehicle moving object if you look at this claim literally. But then the Amgen decision from the court could cause you to take a second look at this claim. Did you give enough teaching in that specification to actually detect any non-vehicle moving object? Is there any situation in which your actual teaching might fail such a broad claim? Maybe, for practitioners in artificial intelligence, everyone knows how to train a neural network to do whatever you want it to in terms of object recognition. Maybe someone will read that specification and say, you know what? Any object I want to train it to do, I have to feed training images of those objects. And your neural network will develop the ability over time to do it. So maybe an expert in a case would say, hey, that's not undue experimentation. We all know how to do that. An expert in that field would get how to train the AI. Another expert may argue, well, there could be failures based on what the images actually are able to detect. This becomes a battle in the court. This shows you a very typical situation in which an AI type of claim might get more scrutiny, if it's interpreted consistently with the Amgen decision. And this is the kind of thing that maybe people weren't thinking about 5 years ago, maybe 10 years ago. And we have to kind of take a second look at our claims, especially in fields where you're doing some kind of broad recognition, which usually is the ultimate goal of many patentees in this area. Next slide, please. So in that example, a couple questions come out. Will it be enough that the specification discloses to those skilled in the art how to make and use the claimed invention so that the AI model can be trained to detect any potential non-vehicle object different than the one considered by the inventors? Or will the specification have to cumulatively identify and make all or nearly all possible recognition scenarios without substantial time and effort? This could fall either way. It would be argued heavily. But it's the kind of thing that if you're in the drafting stage, you want to consider it, what kind of scrutiny will this get after they get the patent? And you want to take a second look at your functional claims that have these broad terms in them. Because sometimes these, one thing about Amgen, same with Alice, is that these cases don't just look forward, they look backward. Existing patents get thrown in too. And there are many patents on the books that, the patent attorney, the patent practitioner was trying really hard to get you as broad a claim as you can, and then they were successful, then this patent is out there that is subject to this kind of scrutiny now. And you have to think about that these patents are both forward-looking and backward-looking, because we didn't create a new law, we're just reinterpreting existing law. And it's the same thing with 101. We had to look back at old cases that didn't see this coming and didn't see this kind of scrutiny coming, and we have to kind of look back at our patent portfolios and make sure that we don't have these kind of red flags in the claims. Next slide, please. So similar to AI, sometimes the software patents we get in new technology, they take a lot of different twists and turns. Sometimes they're technical, sometimes they're a little bit ambiguous in how they kind of convey what you're trying to do. One of the emerging technologies that we've seen a huge surge in the past couple of years is what we call chatbot technology. You think ChatGPT. We have generative AI. We have things that are trying to mimic sort of human output, human recognition, almost to the point where you're trying to invent technology that passes as human. And it's very valuable in a lot of industries. In customer support, this is very valuable. You're trying to get online to get something fixed, and you're talking to people in the chat box, but it's pretending to be human. It's pretending to be like Jeff from Arizona, talking to you about your computer problem. And the customer has to feel like they're talking to a person. It's very important. Bad customer experience could lead to bad commercial results for a company. So we have a lot of chatbot technology coming out, but there are things that are in these patents that are hard to convey technically. This particular chatbot patent that I pulled up is about sort of an AI-trained patent directed to like turning down someone for a loan. Maybe you get like an automated response, someone apply for a loan, and they're saying, we are unfortunate, we can't give you this loan. But it's not a person, it's the actual chatbot giving this information. And the example in the spec is sort of saying, we cannot offer you this loan. We are so sorry for informing you so late. It's styled in a sad tone. And the reason for doing that is because, you don't want to just say, hey, no, you're denied this loan. You want it to be human. You want the customer experience to still be, natural. And this is very important for companies, anytime you're dealing with technical support, not to feel like you're getting bad news from a computer. But the claim itself, the actual problem they describe is that, a lot of the computers, they can emit audio in a flat, unexpressive manner. They have to kind of give some emotion. That's the solution. And so they're trying to solve this problem, not to come off as quote unquote flat. Next slide, please. So this is the actual claim that went with that patent, an actual patented claim, by the way. There's a lot in the claim, a lot of details about what they call the TTS model. That's kind of the AI aspect of this patent. But I want to focus on the bold underlined portion of the patent. When the TTS model is configured to output the spoken utterance with an emotion, okay? And that kind of jumped out to me, like especially after the Amgen decision. You can train something to output something in a sad tone. You can do key words to give that tone, like you saw the example before. They use the word sorry, but this is a very broad part of the claim. You can output it with quote unquote an emotion. Is that any emotion that you cover? Can you do funny? Can you do sarcastic? What is the meats and bounds of that claim with regards to emotion? After Amgen, you have to ask yourself, does a full scope cover output with an emotion, and did they enable that scope? And that's the kind of thing you have to be careful about in these new kind of technologies, especially AI, where when you're trying to mimic something that's human, these technical terms, they can be sort of lost in the translation. And we have applications that are applied for all over the world. They get translated into different languages. You're trying to take something that is a little bit hard to describe, make it technical, but then make your claim broad enough to describe what is a good, valuable scope for your client. Maybe putting the claim output the utterance with a sad emotion is too narrow. But then what do you do? And we'll kind of go into that a little later as we talk about some of the practice tips when you're dealing with these kind of challenges. Next slide, please. So, we took a look at some examples in the AI arts, in chatbot arts, and we even saw some old smartphone application situations where you want broad claims and you're kind of faced with this Amgen decision, you're kind of faced with that possibility that you're going to see more scrutiny down the road based on what we saw with Alice. So what do you do as a patent practitioner? You want to look at your roadmap, definitely. They talked about that in the Amgen case. Is there a good roadmap for them to get that kind of coverage that they're trying to get? Is it adequate? And part of doing that is making sure you have good, diverse examples in your specification. Like really try to think hard about what you're trying to claim and what kind of embodiments and variations of embodiments could exist. And when you have a chance to draft application, you have a chance to fix that. So include diverse examples of different embodiments and give you the claim scope you're looking for. And determine which actual examples actually work, and make sure your claims have a focus on those embodiments. Because what'll happen, if you get the broad claim coverage, and there's what we call sort of a fail example, where the alleged infringer's attorney comes up with an example that fails what you put in your specification, meaning the claim won't work with that particular example. That's a problem. They could do that and they say, look, the claim fails with this, but the claim covers this. And you want to make sure that you know what fails with your actual teaching. Draft reasonable claims. I think that there's some extreme cases where you have to use some broad language, but you want to be careful not to cover too much either, where you're going to get this kind of scrutiny. Where you want to be aware of the fact that you're at least trying that in the independent claim, and you want to hedge for that in your other claims. And next tip, you want to create those subgenus claims that focus on specific embodiments. Suppose that you do get the broad claim allowed. Make sure that all your claims aren't going to fall. They have some dependent claims that kind of get you some value, even if those broad independent claims fall in some kind of post-grant proceeding. And one thing we said is that these cases look backwards and forward. You may have existing patents on your portfolio that may have this problem before Amgen, and you didn't really get a chance to really clean it up ahead of time. You might have to look for the really valuable patents. You may have to look at reissue and see, okay, what should we try to correct now? And if you're, especially if you're trying to correct or make it more narrow, you have a little more opportunity to do that under U.S. practice. So there's some practices to consider. Let me see how much time we have here. Well, we have a little more time for questions. I'm going to ask Richard, do you have any extra thoughts you want to convey after seeing the full slides? Well, we try to take some questions from the audience, and I'll try to put some additional chat points as well.
What's an example of a roadmap that has a chance of being adequate? Is what it goes. Now mind you, I have zero knowledge of software, and even less than that when you get into AI.
Well, look, AI, one thing that is great about AI is that, it's one of those cases where a lot of the the building of the neural network might be done by known technology. There's different kinds of technology out there to actually build a neural network based on training. If you're using that kind of conventionally known technology, understand what your black box needs to give you the output you need. So if you're doing object recognition, you may have to say like, we're trying to recognize any object in the road in my self-driving car example. And if you're trying to train it to look for like pedestrians on bicycles, you may say, okay, for this example, give it, a million pictures of pedestrians on bicycles from different angles. Therefore, you're going to want to label that, give it to the neural network, the deep learning model, and it's predictable that over time it will have some kind of convergence to recognize when a pedestrian on a bicycle is in the image. So, and then you can take that and say, for any kind of object in the roadway, feed it, X number of images and label the images accordingly of what you're actually trying to identify. And maybe that's an adequate roadmap for AI. But for the other example I gave, the chatbot example, where you talk about, emotions, outputting an emotion, that's a little more complicated because the emotion comes through vocabulary, right? You use the word sorry. Sorry in itself conveys an emotion. But if you're trying to, make jokes or something like that, be humorous, that's a little more complicated. You can't just give one word to convey that kind of feeling or emotion. You have to have more to it. And your roadmap may require more to get that kind of coverage. And so you have to think about where things fail and where they succeed in terms of what you're teaching. And you may have to think about different language in your claims that kind of cover maybe the specific portion of coverage that will give you what you want. So I think that, the roadmap is probably technology specific, what people can predict in the arts. And, we constantly kind of ask the inventors, like, would a person know how to do this thing you're telling me to do? Because, we're just a patent attorney. So we have to ask the inventors, like, is this possible? And you try to throw examples at the inventors as well, saying, well, what if I do this? What if I do that? Like, can your invention cover that? And, we have to be a little more careful about it these days because, we get a lot of broad claims, a lot of people seeking broad claims, especially in the area of standard essential patents. We have this idea of sort of targeting a standard rather than your own specification. And, a lot of people don't see it coming sometimes, but you're trying to keep the claim locked into a certain language. And you have to look back and say, is my roadmap, going to be adequate for supporting that? So that's a great question. I think that's our job as patent practitioners, to really investigate where failures occur in the instructions that essentially our spec is requiring. And I think one thing that you brought up that was something that I really never thought about before was the idea that enablement is sort of tied to patent eligibility. This idea that, we often think of the abstract idea thing as something where, it's just sort of categorical. Can you claim this or not? And you kind of gave a new twist on it, saying, these things are both really very similar issues. They have sort of the same analysis happening to them. And I never thought about that before. So I think that you definitely opened my mind on terms of how these cases actually go hand in hand. So yeah, that's my spiel in response to your question.
Samir, we've got a couple of questions.
All right.
And I'll read you the first one.
Okay.
And it goes, should applicants wait until the inventor has actually determined a structural functional relationship, even if not a perfect one, as it may include inoperative embodiments or not every tested potential embodiment? What's your thought on that?
Okay, sorry, I gotta expand my question. Can you read that question one more time, because I can't really see it?
Sure.
Yeah.
Should applicants wait until the inventor has actually determined a structural functional relationship, even if not a perfect one, as it may include inoperative embodiments or not every tested potential embodiment?
Should they wait till they have the structural function relationship? Well, the perfect world, yes. The inventor has come up with their idea in full, and they know the exact structure and the function to achieve it, and they know exactly what's going to work and what's going to fail. I think what happens realistically though is that the clock is ticking, and the applicant, they have the idea, they've talked it through, they're ready to file, and get something on file, and you're kind of talking to the inventor in kind of an incubation phase sometimes, and you just want to have a good enough kind of background and to ask the right questions to kind of flesh it out with the inventor kind of in real time. I mean, realistically, that's what happens a lot of times, that there is highly competitive market space. We want to get that filing date locked in, and we have to kind of, pull it out at the same time while we're trying to hope that they have enough kind of completed. I hope that answers that question.
Just my only comment is in the life science area, quite often you don't learn about the structural functional relationship until there's been developments further down the road where it becomes apparent. So I would not wait if you're in life sciences. The second question relates to Marcouche Group. How broad Marcouche claims in chemical practice are affected by Amgen v. Sanofi decision? I guess that should be how broad all Marcouche claims really affected by it. There's no single answer. If you're in a very predictable art, for instance, if you're in polymers and you're making a polymer that has certain physical characteristics, the Marcouche group can be very broad because it's a very predictable art. It's been around for decades. In fact, plastics are older than me, which means they're older than dirt. On the other hand, when you get into life sciences, you've got to be very careful. And life science is not just treating diseases in humans or animals. It includes agriculture, where there are a number of factors involved. In agriculture, how are you getting the active ingredient into the plant, and are you translocating it to the roots? How is all that going to happen? Can you predict what's going to happen? So you really have to ask yourself, what is my art? What is the kind of understanding people have? What is the predictability involved? And if it's not very predictable, you've got to keep your Marcouche group tight. And I would recommend not only, I think the way Samir just mentioned, not only a broad claim, but a consistently narrowing where you go from, gee, I think this will work, to where this should work, to where I know this one works. And that would be my recommendation. But again, it's mostly going to hit the life science area, not necessarily the other parts of chemistry. If you're in coatings, for example, a lot of things are predictable. And I don't see any other questions.
Yeah, I think, since we still have a couple of minutes, one thing that we should definitely be paying attention to kind of going forward is, what are the different jurisdictions deal with similar issues a little differently. I know that I've looked at some literature coming out of the Japanese patent office on, training their examiners, and they did focus a lot on written description enablement, especially with AI cases. They kind of saw this as an issue fairly decent amount of time ago, about the idea of kind of having a broad kind of function, a broad recognition kind of aspect coming out of a claim. And they heavily trained their examiners on kind of recognizing where a claim might be weak. I think the U.S. Patent Office probably has some catching up doing this. I used to be a patent examiner a long time ago. And we get kind of cursory training on different issues, especially 102 and 103, and how to spot prior art. But this kind of thing where you see a broad claim and you kind of look back at the spec and you kind of wonder if the roadmap is adequate, that's a tougher issue to train the entire patent examiner corps on. And so the guidance that kind of comes from the leaders at the patent office and how they should kind of handle claims becomes very important. We saw this after 101, a very complex issue, after Alice. And they made a lot of examples. They kind of spoon-fed a lot of information across the entire examining corps on how to prove cases. And it has taken a long time for them to really get their guidance, as in-depth as it is right now. I think, at first you saw a lot of rejections because that's kind of the safe thing to do. Just say, if you're not sure, just reject it. And then you kind of go back and forth with the examiner and their supervisor, and you're trying to say, well, this is what the case law is saying. And maybe you can convince them before you go to appeal, maybe not. But that lack of guidance sort of led to uncertainty. And we could see the same thing here. I'm not sure yet, but we are starting to see maybe a little more pushback on broad claiming in terms of what the specification actually discloses. So I think it's good to pay attention to what kind of the legal minds that the PTO come up with and how they're going to kind of across the board train the examiners how to spot issues on this area. I think that's what I'm looking for as a U.S. patent practitioner. Is what are they going to tell the examiners? Because that's what I have to deal with in my everyday life. It's sort of looking at those fictional examples they create and saying, yeah, we're more like that example than the other example. And so that still has yet to flesh out fully, but that's probably the next thing that we should watch out for. And probably at the EPO as well, keep a close eye on how they're training examiners on this issue if they haven't sort of addressed this issue already in detail. But this is a common issue all over the world. As you said, this quid pro quo mindset is sort of the meat and potatoes of what the patent law is all about. And so this is really a very important issue for them to get right.
There's one more question that came in. It's a follow-up.
All right.
And it is, given prosecution history estoppel, if the genus claim goes down, the pinpoint claim may be limited in its doctrine equivalence, even if unpredictable. Isn't that a good reason to wait to file? I'm having trouble. I gotta scroll down here. The broad claim until an imperfect structure-functional relationship can be established. That's probably not a bad idea, but you got to remember the genus is going to be anticipated by the species. So while it may be the perfect case to wait, like Samir said, the world is not necessarily a perfect place, and technology and business may require you to file early. Quite often that's the case in pharmaceutical, where the structural relationship was developed later. You had to file early because your competitor was working in the same field and might beat you to the same act of moiety.
Yeah, I think that that the idea of waiting is always hard, especially if the applicant or the client has their own deadline, and so maybe they're about to go public with something to get like shareholder funding or outside funding, and those kind of external pressures start to play with a lot of clients. And what happens sometimes though is that sometimes people have one embodiment that they actually have reduced to practice. They actually, one working example they've definitely done, but they don't have the resources to really go in depth with everything that could be done, but they kind of know how it could be done. Maybe the prototype is, based on a smartphone example or one kind of example of structure. But if they had like unlimited resources, they could definitely build every other example, but they have to really think it through. And, if it's possible to come up with a solution, you should definitely try to include it in your spec. Make sure that you've covered it, because you're trying to foresee what people haven't done yet before. Like the potential infringer in theory doesn't exist yet. It could be 2 years down the road, 3 years down the road. You don't know how they're actually going to implement their solution that copies your idea. So you got to be forward thinking in terms of coming up with things that your inventor hasn't done yet. But you have to kind of like help them along and say, okay, like what other ways are there to do it? We should cover that, because that could be commercially available down the road. I mean, it's just everything changes so quickly in terms of how we communicate, how we, store data, how we transmit data, the different types of platforms are out there. We simply don't know what the next thing is. But if there's kind of enough information out there, do your best to cover as many biases as you can.
I don't know where we are, but there's one quick question, and it's on Amgen, and it's for AI. Okay. And his experience in examination is that often the cited reference is very weak in its AI enablement, with some offhand comments, but the examiners are still citing the references. And so his question is, are they scrutinizing things more closely since Amgen came out? And my expectation is they will, but it's still early. Samir, yours?
Yeah, I haven't seen a flood of 35 UFC 112A rejections coming my way yet. Sometimes there's some pushback on, does your spec actually do that or not? I've seen it in a couple cases so far, but really it's one of those things that I think we need to see a lot more training from the PTO to kind of catch these issues in real time and how to do that. And I think Dick mentioned this before that you know, there's more advantages during litigation than during examination. You can get expert testimony, all these things. The examiner can't do that on the spot. They kind of have to take your word for it a little bit with the 132 declarations from the inventor if something is getting really complex as to what existed at the time. And so, it's sort of a feasible challenge for examiners to make that determination that a roadmap is inadequate in the spec. So, maybe the PTO can find a way to simplify that, sort of make an informed issue spotting, but it is one of those things that is complicated by this idea of experts.
I think that's the last of the questions, and I think we're probably out of time.
I think we are. I think we're almost a little over time, but we definitely appreciate everyone taking the time to listen to our webinar today, and to IAM and Luxology for putting together this masterclass and allowing us to be the hosts. Yeah, if you have any questions, sorry, next slide, please. I think everyone will get a copy of this presentation. Our email addresses are on the screen. Feel free to ask us any questions if you think of them later, or if you're watching the recorded version of this webinar. And if you ever want to reach out to us for anything else, we'd be more than happy to talk to you. But we definitely appreciate everyone's time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.